All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jennifer Apicella, and I'm currently the director for PGH.AI. And I'd like to welcome you to today's speaker series event with Emily Kennedy. So before we dig into that fireside chat discussion, which is going to be fascinating, for those of you who aren't familiar with PGH.AI, I just wanted to let you know, PGH.AI is a community-led volunteer organization. And as you can see here, we're really just dedicated to improving the ability for the general public from all backgrounds, from all different areas, to learn more and participate in our region's rich AI ecosystem. We have a lot of different companies, a lot of different organizations, a lot of different research efforts, and people doing amazing things in this space. And sometimes the space, being often high tech, can seem intimidating or maybe overwhelming to some. And a lot of times it's just really not. And so what we strive to do is, at least definitely through this speaker series, is try and break that down, help you understand how AI technologies apply to you, how they're used in society, how they're used in different industries, and how you can just relate to them as a general human being. So that's sort of our mission and what we're focused on. We try and bring people together around that concept. And PGH.AI is an initiative. It's part of PART. PART is the Partnership to Advance Responsible Technology. It is a local nonprofit, and they do amazing things, consulting work, and a whole variety of other, through a team of deep expertise individuals, just really trying to bring AI and responsible technology, ethics and policy decision-making conversations to the table so that we can be smarter as a region while we're dealing with these types of things. And lastly, I'll just say, if you want to learn more about PGH.AI, we encourage you to check out the links in the chat. At the very least, please subscribe to our newsletter. We send out a monthly newsletter with all sorts of fun news and interesting activities, jobs, and opportunities related to the AI space. You can also submit, we have a volunteer form, so if you want to get involved, perhaps you want to dedicate some hours of your time in your life to contributing to our efforts, that would be great. And if you are an individual who can speak on something AI and responsible technology related, we'd love to hear from you. So check out the links in the chat, reach out to us, and we can get in touch. All right, well, with that, I'm going to turn things over to our fantastic chat moderator, Eugene. So Eugene, I'll let Eugene introduce himself and our speaker for the day.
Perfect, thanks so much, Jen, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So my name is Eugene Leventhal. I'm currently a full-time project manager at Carnegie Mellon within CyLab, which is the University Security and Privacy Institute. There I manage projects relating to AI, IoT, blockchain, and cybersecurity more broadly. And overall, sort of the way that technology impacts humans and the feedback loops in between are topics that very much interest me. So I'm very excited to have today's conversation. And outside of sort of my full-time job, I'm actually currently launching a personal consultancy focused on helping organizations in the blockchain space, especially in terms of setting up grant programs and ecosystem development. And outside of technology, a main area of interest of mine is podcasting, where actually next Thursday, I'll be launching a new podcast focused on exploring meaning in and of life. So yeah, very excited for that. And I'm also very happy to be a PGH.AI ambassador and get to co-organize this speaker series with Jen and some other folks on our team. And yeah, again, thank you for everyone who joined. And so today's conversation, I'm personally very excited for, because I had heard of Emily back when I first got to Pittsburgh and the work that she's been doing. So to give a quick little intro of Emily, she's the president and founder of Marinus Analytics, which is a social impact company spun out of CMU that specifically creates tools, AI-based tools to fight and combat human trafficking. The flagship software there is called Trafficking, which leverages big data and AI to identify and locate victims of sex trafficking sold online and dismantle organized criminal networks. Traffic Jam operates in the United States, Canada, and the UK, with continued global expansion and progress. Emily greatly enjoys telling the stories of impact that Marinus has made in the global community, showcasing the team's innovative spirit in the realm of AI for good and bringing life to the company's core goals and long-term strategy. Emily is a social impact entrepreneur. She was on the Forbes 30 Under 30. Also got a Toyota Mother of Innovation, as well as one of entrepreneurs' most powerful women and a keynote speaker. She also hosts the wonderful Empower podcast, which we'll plug a few times today, and also coaches founders on how to build businesses that change the world. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Eugene and Jen, for inviting me. And just thanks for everyone who's joined the conversation today. I think it's going to be fun.
Absolutely. And so the focus of today's conversation for anyone who's just hopping in is combating human trafficking, looking at it specifically as a case study around a mission-driven career. So we're going to talk about the actual use case of the technology and using AI to combat human trafficking, as well as more the journey and the case study aspect of what's it like to build something like this. So before actually kicking off with the first question, I just want to remind folks, please make sure to drop any questions you have as we go along in the chat. If it's appropriate to bring them up mid-conversation, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat, but we do have time at the end dedicated just for Q&A. So feel free to drop any questions you have along the way into the chat. And everyone is going to be muted during our conversation, but towards the end when we open up for Q&A, we'll give people the chance to hop off mute. Just let us know in chat if you would like to hop on mic and say anything. So yeah, with that, Emily, I want to kick off the conversation with the overall question of, when did you first have that realization that you were interested at the intersection of social impact and technology?
Yeah, great question. So for me, the social impact piece started when I was 16. I share the story a lot, but it really basically changed my life. I was traveling through Eastern Europe, driving down from Budapest, Hungary, down to the country of Albania, which is a gorgeous country, by the way. And so we were driving through a number of different countries in Eastern Europe to get there. And we passed through this tiny little town and saw that there were a bunch of kids begging on the street, mostly younger. And you'll see that in different places, but a bunch of the kids ran up to our car when we were waiting at the stoplight and tried to wash our car windows. And there was something to me that just felt off about it. I couldn't really tell what it was. But I asked my friend after we passed through that area, like, what's going on there? What's the situation with all those children there? And my friend who's from Eastern Europe said, well, they're probably trafficked by the Russian mob. They're most likely orphans who are taken advantage of by these mobsters who basically have them beg on the street all day, and then they have to bring back any money to the mob that they make, and they take their money. And that was my firsthand experience with human trafficking and just the fact that exploitation like that was happening in the world. I grew up in a good situation, sheltered, and that really opened my eyes. And I think it was really impactful that it happened at a fairly young age, like I said, 16, because it really stuck with me pretty heavily. So, fast forward like 5 to 7 years, and I'm a student at Carnegie Mellon. I'm a humanities student. And ever since I was a teenager, I kind of felt in my heart that human trafficking, I want to work in combating that somehow in my career. And there wasn't really any obvious career path set before me for that. Probably the most obvious would have been become a lawyer, become like a human rights lawyer. And that's kind of what I thought I was going to do. So I was studying humanities at Carnegie Mellon, one of the kind of unusual humanities students there. Obviously, the university is known for tech and all things tech. But there came a time around my junior year when a lot of it was the timing that sex trafficking had moved in recent years around that time from the streets in-person advertisement to online. And so I was kind of just observing like, oh, this transition, kind of reading about it. And in my senior year, it came time to do my senior honors thesis, and I knew that I wanted to dig into this issue more somehow. And so I thought that intersection of technology and social impact was really interesting. Through my thesis, I started talking with local detectives in Pittsburgh about, like, okay, you do human trafficking investigations. How does that work? And what are you looking for? And what are the pitfalls to trying to investigate using online information? How can we make the process better? So I got connected with Dr. Dabrowski at the Robotics Institute in the Auton Lab, and got thrown into the deep end of what is machine learning and AI, and how can it help. So as it turns out, anyone who knows the Auton Lab knows that they are working on machine learning solutions to all different kinds of problems, everything from nuclear threat detection to epidemic detection. They've been supporting the city of Pittsburgh on COVID work. And so, yeah, Dr. Dabrowski was like, oh, we're kind of doing tangential work in these other areas, getting insights out of big data. And, I think that we could apply it to your area too. So that is kind of how it all started, the long-winded version.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a whole separate rabbit hole we can go down from your origin story of just digging into Albania and some of the history and current state and organized crime versus government there. But too early to go on that much of a tangent.
Right.
So to keep us on track, you mentioned you were studying humanities. Do you mind just mentioning what was the specific kind of major you were studying at the time?
Yeah, so I settled on, after like 2+ years of deliberating, I settled on ethics, history, and public policy. And the reason was that I really enjoyed philosophy classes and I really enjoyed history classes, but I didn't want to go 100% one or the other. And so when I found out about the EHPP degree, and I think I was like the second class to graduate with a degree, like it was very new. It was led by Dr. Jay Aronson, who is my thesis advisor. He's fantastic, and he heads up the Center for Human Rights Science at Carnegie Mellon as well. And so, yeah, so that was my major, and I really liked how because sometimes for me, it felt like with philosophy, for instance, you can get really deep in the theory and kind of hypotheticals, but I was more interested, and that's super interesting, but I was more interested in like, okay, how does it affect our lives? How does it affect the real world? And then it was the same approach with tech. And thankfully, Dr. Dabrowski shared the same perspective of like, writing research papers is great. Obviously, that's a big part of what they do. They're a university lab, but he had a view towards, how can we get technology out of the lab? How can we actually make a change in the world? So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, the theoretical versus applied is definitely a notable distinction there. And so I guess following your track with the story you were telling us, so you start working with the Auton Lab. At that point, how deep were you into AI? Or, had you taken courses on the topic before, or were you kind of learning as you go at that point?
Great question. Not deep at all. The one claim to tech class fame that I had at that time was that I took one Java programming class at Carnegie Mellon, and I think it was right before they had switched to Python because Java was like antiquated. So I really enjoyed that one class. And I think what it taught me is basically that like programming and all that kind of stuff is not magic. There's rules to it, there's a language. And so it gave me just a little peek into that. But it really was in the deep end for sure, because I just didn't have any formal training or experience in it. And I remember my first meeting with Dr. Dabrowski in Newell Simon Hall, and I distinctly remember the moment that I walked out of that meeting and I thought, oh my gosh, I am way in over my head, because he started pulling in, research programmers and all these really smart people to like brainstorm what we might work on together. And, half the terms they're using, like I don't recognize. And so there was this like, oh, I'm way in over my head feeling, but it was also this feeling of like, but there's something here and there's something that I need to pursue, and almost like a curiosity of like, I don't know what this is, but I want to know more and I want to learn, if this could really help solve the problem. And so that was the beginning of a lot of like on the ground learning for me.
Yeah. And I mean, at that point, when, you walk out of that kind of meeting and that kind of personal feeling of, oh man, am I over my head or what's going on? When you were at that general stage, how much do you feel was fear a concern or contributing factor or limitation in terms of you just being able to jump in head first, whether it was fear of sort of being in over your head or fear of failure or the Stockholm or anything else that kind of could come up there?
I think it was fear of the unknown mostly. I didn't really have fear of failure because I didn't really have a sense of what I would be failing at. Like it wasn't like laid out for me like, oh, I could fail in this big way. But I think also like my dad, just how my dad raised me, like I get a lot of questions sometimes around like, where did your confidence come from? Or basically, what made you think you could do this, And it was almost for me like I didn't think that I couldn't do something. So yeah, it wasn't really, I never thought it would grow to what it's grown to now. So there wasn't really like a clear, oh, I'm gonna, not get this job interview or I'm gonna tank at this job. It was kind of like inventing something new. And I think that's what was really alluring about it. And that is for a lot of people, one of the most fun parts of starting a company and that for me was one of the most fun parts was when you're the only person working on it, you're like in your pajamas on the couch, on your computer, blasting Rage Against the Machine, like working on your project. And like, it's just your thing. And it's like exciting because you're kind of building something new, you're discovering something as you go. And I think that really kept me going because that part was super interesting to me.
Yeah, and you mentioned a point that really sticks out to me, and is one I think about a lot in terms of, how much does a person need to have the audacity to think they can change the world versus how much you shouldn't be your first detractor and just be like, well, until I prove to myself that I can't, I'm going to assume that maybe it is possible.
Yeah.
And how much is it just that pure mindset switch versus actually being like, well, no, I can move mountains and change the, how much of that ego do you actually need to have there?
I mean, it's a good question. I think a lot of it was just blind naivety. Like, again, I didn't think like, and actually I took, I'll tell this funny story. I took a finance class at Hines because in my senior year, in my major, I wanted to take some master's courses. So I started taking courses for the master's in public policy and management. Great classes at Hines, of course. And I took a finance class. And we, at one point, had to review the financial statements of failed companies. And I'm pretty sure I said this out loud to my friend. I was like, people who start companies are either delusional or they're idiots. Like, I would never do this. It's so risky. Like, how scary. Like, I was very much a researcher. That was my first job before we started the company, was working as a research analyst at the lab. And I also just had personally like a researcher's mindset, like a perfectionist mindset, where I want to know everything about a subject before I make decisions. And I want to be an expert on everything before I want to have all the information. And that was just something that you can't do as an entrepreneur. You can like pretty much never have all the information before you need to make decisions. But yeah, I think a lot of it was just kind of like naivety mixed with, I guess, like a real focus on the mission. So the only reason that I started the company was as a means to an end. Like, okay, if this is how we need to commercialize this technology, that's what I'm going to do. It could have as well been a nonprofit. It could have been, any organization. It didn't really matter to me. I wasn't like Gary Vee selling baseball cards to my friends at age 10, like always knew I wanted to own a business. No, that was not me at all.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and jumping back to kind of the journey and specifically leading up to Marinus then, so you mentioned kind of the origin story point. You mentioned that while you were at school, you approached the Auton Lab. So which came first in terms of wanting to formalize this as a thesis and dig into more research versus let's just start doing some work with this lab and kind of see where things go?
Yeah, it was basically at the same time. So I had started doing a little bit of work on myself by myself, probably maybe like 2 or 3 months before, well, maybe 1 or 2 months, something like that before. Because there was a point where basically how I came to work with the lab was that I was working with Jay Aronson, my humanities advisor, and I pitched in this idea of like using tech to basically identify victims of sex trafficking who are sold online. And he was like, great, that sounds great, but you need to go get a technical advisor. Like, I can't advise you on the technical side. And so I got far enough to kind of have the idea. And I think I had interviewed a couple of law enforcement by then. But then after that, it was pretty much all with the lab. It was like, my thesis was done with the lab, and then I went to work for the lab right after graduation and continued the project that we had started together.
Yeah. And at that point, were you already working on what would become Traffic Jam, or was it a different focus at that early stage?
It was kind of like the fossils of traffic jams. So if you go read my thesis, and anyone could go find it, it's called Predictive Patterns of Sex Trafficking Online by Emily Kennedy. And it's on I think it's now called KillTub or something, whatever the CMU website for that is. But it's really funny to look back on that because I was recently, I wrote that about 10 years ago. And I was recently asked to write a chapter on technology and human trafficking for a human trafficking textbook, which was really cool. I wish that had been around when I was in college. But anyways, when I went to write that textbook, and you got that in the chat there, thank you. When I went to write the textbook, I thought, well, let me go back to my thesis and kind of refresh on that, because my thesis, what it did was it gave a lot of the history of the move to online sources and the big players and kind of the legal issues with the Communications Decency Act. And I was actually like pretty proud looking back 10 years later, like I did a pretty good job, summarizing the context. And that was like a huge part of humanities, is like you have to summarize the whole like landscape of what you're talking about. So I did that. And then when I say fossils of traffic jam, in my thesis, it was kind of saying, well, it was a lot of manual work with the data, but saying, well, we think this group appears to be, a massage parlor that might be linked to organized crime. And here are some of the indicators that, based on talking to law enforcement, that we think this, that's the reasons that we think this. And what's cool is that, looking 5-10 years in the future, that stuff held up pretty well. Like, obviously like indicators and keywords change over time, but the concept was pretty solid. And then creating Traffic Jam, which we created the first prototype in 2013 when I was working at the lab. And it kind of became that's when it became its own prototype to do like the work for my thesis. I was using homegrown software from the lab, which allowed me to like look at trends in the data and just do some really, preliminary like interacting with the data as a researcher. And so Traffic Jam kind of automated a lot of that stuff and made it easier to use and kind of like brought it to bear from a user perspective.
Got it. And let's jump ahead for a moment to actually talk about, just because it's been mentioned so much, you've alluded to this in part, but what is Traffic Jam and what are the specific service offerings that people engage with Traffic Jam on today?
Great question. So Traffic Jam is a suite of AI investigative tools for human trafficking investigations, and it includes a number of, I say suite of AI tools because it's a bunch of different stuff. So everything from just like simple search, where if the detective has like the cell phone number of a missing victim, they can type that in, or image pattern recognition. If there's the same bedspread used in multiple photos, that can help identify multiple victims advertised in the same group or in the same hotel room, for instance. So there's a whole number of different AI tools, as well as just like simple convenience tools like alerts and things that just save time for the user. And so what it does is it looks at these online sources where victims are typically advertised, all publicly available data, and then empowers the investigator to look into that. So it's a SaaS model, software as a subscription. we keep it pretty affordable. It's nothing like Palantir prices. Like when people think of us, they might think of a company like that, but we're very much wanting to make a social impact and give tools that can be used by smaller agencies as well. And then we're also used by nonprofits like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So they're one of the more notable ones. They're pretty well known, and they're based in DC, government funded, and their main goal with respect to human trafficking, because they do all kinds of missing children investigations, but with respect to human trafficking, what they do is they use Traffic Jam as one of their tools that they process the nearly 10,000 child sex trafficking tips that they get every year. So these are missing children that are believed to be trafficked for sex. And so they'll process those tips and then put together reports or packages that they'll then forward to law enforcement to actually continue an investigation.
And so just to dig into that a little more, so if I'm, say, some law enforcement agency that's actively dealing with whether a single case or multiple, but something around human trafficking, if I'm engaging with Traffic Hub and with Marinus overall, am I getting this software which I'm then running on my data? Is it sort of, we have data that we've collected, or are there, is part of the benefit that you're scraping these online sources where I'm assuming it might be linked to dark web markets and other kind of anonymous illicit markets where these kind of transactions take place? Just what's the nature, I guess, of where the data comes from?
Yeah, that's a great question. So and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this, because a lot of times when people hear AI, they're like, oh my gosh, people are like, surveilling me on street corners and traffic cameras and stuff. No, that is not what we do. All the data that we archive is from publicly available classifieds websites primarily. So we don't do social media. We only do publicly available websites. So we're not, doing even dark web sources. A reason for that is, and this is evolving, so this may change in the future, but how it's been for us so far is that due to the nature of sex trafficking, where it wants to masquerade as at-will sex work. So obviously there's a difference, or maybe I have to state this. Some people don't know that there is a difference. The majority of online sex ads are for at-will sex workers, people who are working at their own volition, they don't have a trafficker, and a subset of those are the sex trafficking victims. And so because of the nature of that, because a trafficker will make the most money if they can advertise publicly, we haven't found it to be too frequent that this type of activity ends up on the dark web. The dark web with respect to child exploitation is typically more for child porn cases, because those situations have a lot harder time living on the public web without being identified and taken down, or having enforcement on those cases. So that's where anonymity is really important, on top of the fact that at least in the traditional models, if you're buying sex from Craigslist or Backpage or wherever, you're going to want to meet that person in person at some point. And that's probably changing now because we've got COVID, we've got everything's more virtual, but in the traditional model, typically there's going to be an in-person meet. Whereas in child porn investigations that typically live more on the dark web, the whole point is anonymity. So like in person isn't going to be as common. So we don't work on the dark web currently. Again, it's always an evolving space, so you never know, but currently this activity can live freely on the public web. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, part of me is also just trying to understand, because just from my personal experience, in terms of global illicit markets, I've by far spent the most time looking at drug markets and maybe arms markets secondarily, but not even as close as drug markets. But I also just wonder, because I know something like shipping and the role that the shipping industry plays in, say, the global cocaine traffic or global heroin trafficking. The more I learn about that, the more it makes me seem of, organized crime plus shipping companies. There are more links than we would care to believe on the surface. And what little I've learned about how kind of organized criminal markets around sex trafficking work, it also seems like shipping and just any kind of maritime based travel where there's just so much less oversight think of even small ports wherever people might be dialing in from. It is super hard to keep track of, and even a reasonable percent, right? Even 5 to 10% of the incoming packages is already hard.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I know on the drug side, I was living in New York before coming to New York. Like there's no, that literally that port is in 2 different states across multiple municipalities. It's almost impossible to track things. So I wonder how much of the focus is, say, at, and apologies if I don't know the correct terminology here, but how much is it in sort of that last point where there is that, whether a person is willingly choosing to do this or due to coercion they are being offered, how much is it at that last point versus how much of the tools can actually be used to say, oh, well, person X went missing in this location at this time, and we can actually use this system to think of, oh, well, here are the high probability places they might end up, given what we know about trends in organized crime and the networks themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point about drug markets. And I actually I'm by no means an expert, but around the time that I started this project in the summer, I spent a good amount of time reading about the Silk Road and other online drug markets, because there is a lot of stuff you can learn and just a lot of tangential like ideas and applications. So I think there's definitely something there. With respect to like channels of trade and communication channels and things like that, I think that's definitely why you see like if you've got an organized crime group and they have existing channels to move people or drugs or whatever, and they have existing communications and contacts, why wouldn't they diversify? When you're talking about an economic perspective, why wouldn't they, if they already have drug channels, why wouldn't they diversify that into humans? And there's pros and cons with that. So the pros for trafficking a human versus trafficking in drugs is, some of the obvious ones. You can reuse a human many, many times. With drugs, you sell it and it's gone and you have to create more. But the other thing is that where a drug cannot do this, a human can actually defend the trafficker and either refuse to give up information about the trafficker or take the fall for the trafficker. And that happens a lot with sex trafficking situations where the victim will have the focus, the trafficker can remain anonymous, and they can cycle victims in and out. So I think about that. And yeah, I mean, that's so when from a user perspective, kind of the way that that the sex trafficking investigations will often start is that it starts with a tip about a missing person who's believed to be trafficked or a missing child. Often it's the family who comes out and says, we think that our daughter is trafficked. We think that she was hanging out with, this guy, and we think he might be a trafficker. So a lot of times it'll start with a tip or a piece of information. And then similarly, and I kind of alluded to this before, but it'd probably be good to mention specifically that usually the cases range from your low-level trafficker who has like 1 or 2 victims traveling regionally in the United States to the large organized crime linked group that has, say, massage parlors or brothels across the US. We worked a case that's on our website under articles. The title is like Pittsburgh Partnerships. We worked with some Pittsburgh organizations on a case that involved, I believe that case involved dozens of victims who were trafficked into the US from China and then rotated across different brothels. And this group, their customer database had like 30,000 customer phone numbers. So you can imagine they're probably making a lot of money. And there's another similar group that we're working with some different federal agencies on. I can't say too much about it, but what I can say is that we're estimating that they're making like at least tens of millions of dollars, just based on the patterns of the activity that we're seeing in the scope. So these are like big groups. And when you think about, all that money can fund other elements of their organized crime. And it's just like a huge kind of web when you start pulling on one thread.
It'd be good to unmute. And that's another area where I know last year, what was it, in July-ish of last year, there was I'm forgetting the name, but it was this one super encrypted phone company in Europe that local, I think it was Interpol, got to break them, and there was raid of over, I think it was a couple hundred raids that were simultaneously coordinated, and a lot of the focus on, whether it's the Mexican cartels, the Italian mob organization, whatever the more stereotypical things we in the US think of, it's usually like drugs and then guns. But the sad reality is that that is by no means the extent of how these organizations make their funds. And there's so much less focus, relatively speaking. We've had the war on drugs, which have spent how many hundreds of billions of dollars relative to what's been our intense push ending human sex trafficking. So, or human trafficking of any kind. But anyway, so without going too deep down that the road, unpacking the current budget line items on organized crime books, but focusing in on your story and jumping back to sort of the narrative of how you got to building out Traffic Jam and people actually using it. So we mentioned already, it was in the thesis, you were working on that as you were starting an intern as part of the Auton Lab. I believe you already mentioned that you had started interning there and kind of working there full time. So what was kind of the process like as you start having the shells of what will become Traffic Jam, going from that point to actually having your first paying client, or even just the first person actually using any of the tools, even if they weren't paying? What was that journey like?
Ooh, that was a big journey because I knew nothing about commercialization. I didn't even really know, like if someone said that term to me, I'd probably be like, what does that mean? So kind of in short, when we had the prototype of Traffic Jam out, it was like nowhere near where it is now, but it was bringing value at that point. It was doing things that they didn't have access to before. And so I started getting calls from detectives across the US asking like, can you help me on my sex trafficking investigation? So once that started growing, first of all, I was like, of course, yes, I will do whatever I can. But I realized that I couldn't be the bottleneck for like all US sex trafficking investigations. And so we wanted to put a tool into their hands. We wanted to make a tool that distilled these AI tools into something that someone could log in and use fairly easily, because detectives aren't AI experts. And so that has been always the challenge of how do you make advanced technology useful and usable and all of that. And so for the commercialization piece, basically we were like, okay, we need to make this bigger than us. It needs to not be going all through me. And so one of the crucial milestones in that time was we went into the National Science Foundation I-Corps program, which stands for Innovation Corps. And it's basically a 3-month commercialization boot camp for university researchers who want to commercialize technology. And so it was perfect for us. Again, I knew nothing. My 2 co-founders are Dr. Dubrowski and Kara Jones, who's our CEO. She had her MBA. She had a background in robotics. That really rounded out the team. I was not able to do it all on my own for sure. And not having the AI or robotics background, having 2 co-founders who did was really important. So we went into this commercialization boot camp. And in short, it was really the Steve Blank model of getting out of the building, basically talking to customers, not making assumptions about the problem that you think you're solving or the pain points, actually going out and talking to potential users and potential customers about what are your pain points, what is the situation in reality, and how can we help? And so, essentially in that 3-month period, we ended up talking to over 100 potential customers and stakeholders. It was very, very like pressure cooker situation. And, but we learned a lot. And so it was all about validating or invalidating hypotheses. And this is something that like anyone can do if you're thinking about, starting a company or a product. Go to someone, even your friend, who you think might be a user, and say, ask them questions. And it helps if beforehand, I think kind of the key to the process is that you write down, this is my hypothesis. I think detectives, need help on human trafficking investigations. Probably, hopefully it'd be more specific than that, but you get the idea. Write it down and then go ask them questions, but maybe not specifically that question, but ask questions around it to help you understand and then help you validate that assumption or invalidate. So that was huge. And that was like my first just dive into what is entrepreneurship really, and how do you take technology out of a university or research and bring it into the real world. And that led on to some non-traditional funding that we got. So we never got VC funding. We wanted to maintain our social mission. We wanted to maintain our focus. And so we bootstrapped. And one of the ways that we did that was we got National Science Foundation SBIR funding, which stands for Small Business Innovation Research. And I highly recommend people to check it out if you're doing research that needs to be funded. SBIRs are specifically for high risk, high reward research that typically would not get VC funding or other types of funding. So this is great for us. It was perfect for us. And that's what enabled us to kind of bootstrap without kind of getting in a VC funding situation where it actually wouldn't be a good fit for us.
Muted again. And I'm also dropping 2 links in the chat. I know you mentioned
Perfect.
Steve Blank and just his website in case anyone wants to check it out. Did y'all use the business model canvas and that kind of specific tool for thinking
all
that through?
That. Exactly.
Yeah. So if anyone is interested in those resources, between the startup weekend, which now Techstars owned it, but initially it was more of a community run thing that Steve had launched. So yeah, if you are interested, if anyone listening is interested, feel free to follow up on those links. So I guess before we open it up to Q&A, this is going to be my last question. So if anyone else does have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. I know we already have one person who pinged me who's going to hop on mic first after this. But as we kind of wrap up this portion, I mean, we've covered so much, so I feel like we could talk for many, many more hours. But I want to come back to, these kind of resources that you're mentioning, the actual process that you took, the entrepreneurial journey. I wanted to use this chance to just also plug your podcast, because I do think it is a great one, especially with, you're trying to accomplish, I think, you're providing people resources and knowledge and insights to a lot of different areas. And for anyone else who is thinking along the entrepreneurial journey themselves, the most recent episode, and I believe the next 4 or 5-ish, are all part of a mini series focused on the entrepreneurial journey and giving kind of people insight. So yeah, do you mind just mentioning kind of what inspired you to launch it and how you see this kind of fitting with, between this and Marinus and overall where you're heading from here?
Yeah, for sure. So starting the podcast was really a result of 2 things. One is just wanting to build the community around myself more of entrepreneurs, and particularly women entrepreneurs, like who are my role models? And the other part was that I just wanted a one-stop shop for that, because in the process of my work at conferences or wherever, I started meeting these amazing women founders and CEOs, and I'm like, your story is the one that I want to hear about. And I figured, why wouldn't I be the one to help highlight that? And so I started that about 2.5 years ago, going 2.5 years strong. I'm almost to 100 episodes. I'm so excited. I just released my 91st episode. So that's so exciting for me. But I basically interview mostly women, but I got some men in there too, including Kenny Chen, who I believe is on the call. We talked recently, his episode came out just in the last couple months, about AI and ethics and different things that he's working on. But just talking about, everything from like leadership to productivity to mindset, entrepreneurship, starting a business, kind of all of those things. And then, you mentioned a series that we just started, myself and Lisa Thie, who's an entrepreneur as well. And she's a good friend of mine. We just wanted to get together and share some of like our key tips for those who are just starting in entrepreneurship. So this first episode that just came out yesterday was it's a great place to start if you're wanting to dip your toe into entrepreneurship. And it's only about 30-minute episode. But in that episode, we share our favorite free resources that we use to get started, because I think a lot of times it just feels like, do I need to like buy something? Do I need to like get some sort of education? And there was just a lot that we did with totally free resources online. And many of those are tools that we still use to this day. So definitely check that out if that's something that's interesting to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will just mention that the way you both kind of spoke about it and covered it, I was very much like, oh, this would have been such an amazing podcast to listen to whenever you do your first foray into the space of just like, literally, I don't know where to start. I feel like that is such a good one. And I'm forgetting the name of but the person you were recording with, she had mentioned, she had mentioned this, what is it, Startup by Gimlet. And there's also Zigzag, which I think was also released by Gimlet. I'll drop those into those podcasts are just dedicated to more giving you an insider's view as they're actually building a new organization.
Oh my gosh, that is just a shout out for them. Zigzag is great. And they were like recording kind of in the moment as they were working on like a cryptocurrency related startup. And it was cool because so my podcast is more like, interviewing people and they tell their stories and kind of pitfalls of the journey and stuff like that. But Zigzag was like, it's like voice notes, like in the moment, oh crap, this just went wrong. What are we going to do? And that kind of stuff will make you feel a lot less alone when you're on the journey. So highly recommend.
Absolutely. And so with that, I will stop monopolizing the question asking and I'll open it up. I'll ask the first one of Douglas's questions, and then maybe we can get him off mic so he could ask any relevant follow-up or ask the second one. But the first question that he dropped in chat is just, have you reached out to government sources and interviewed with the FBI detachment and the military investigative services as expert services specifically?
Yeah, great question. So back when we first started, before the company existed, we got in touch with Pittsburgh FBI. At that time, I was thinking, do I want to go into the FBI? Like, what am I doing? So I got in touch with their special agent who focused on human trafficking investigations, Brad Orsini. I don't think he works in that area anymore, but got in touch with him over there. And then they've been some of our best super users since the beginning. So they've given us a ton of great input and we've learned a ton from them. And then there's a number of other federal agencies we work with, and then everything from like state attorney general's offices to like local small agencies as well.
Awesome. And then Jen, would you mind just unmuting Douglas so he could, if he has any follow-up to that or just to ask his second question?
Sure.
Hey, thanks. Appreciate it, guys. Yeah, so thanks for asking a question. Appreciate it. Just to elaborate a little bit more. So I was in the military, and so I know there's a lot of resources and a lot of things you can do if you look in the right places for the military or just federal sector. But the second question is kind of piggybacking off that. So I was in the Air Force, and so when I was in the Air Force, I worked with some of the special agents in charge over in OSI, which is like the Air Force's version of FBI. When I was in Japan, and I'm Japanese, and I was born there, grew up there, all that stuff. So I know that before 2014, Japan, it was legal to have like child pornography and stuff like that, magazines. And you'd see in like, gas stations or like 7-Eleven, stuff like that. And so it was bad. But they would have like all that stuff, like cartoons and all that. And it was just, that was disgusting and gross. And then when I joined the military and I was there, I was like, there's still like these magazines and stuff, but they got rid of like in 2014, they got rid of like the actual like real child pornography. But being an American citizen, and even when I was a kid, I was like, this is disgusting. Like, why is it even, allowed? Why is it in magazines and stuff like that, or, even as a cartoon or this stuff? And so when you go to different countries, you see, that's the laws, they're okay with it as long as it's not real sex trafficking. So I guess leading up to it is when I was working with OSI and I was helping the special agents in charge, I wanted to kind of have that same power as you. I wanted to make a difference. And because it was also my home country. So it was like, I grew up here. I know these streets. I know this area. I know open hour. And so I want to help take drugs off of the streets. I want to help people, not just to be safe again, and not to feel like, oh, do I have to worry about, you know, Tatsu Moya down the street, like, buying magazines or potentially running a sex ring. So I helped out with that. But one of the kind of big things we ran across was, uh, do they have legal possession of, these fake child pornography or underage porn, documentation or videos, or is it illegal? Are they illegally doing stuff and getting it from another source? So that's one of the things we kind of encountered, with my experiences and helping them is, is it legal or not, or try and get over some of those hurdles. So have you encountered, because I know your software is being used in the United States, and you have experiences working with, the FBI agents, and your software is being used in Canada and UK, you said. So if you're planning on branching out to other countries, have you encountered or even researched on, what their laws are and their stances are on underage pornography or even sex rings and
Yeah.
like drug trafficking?
I think that's a great question. So first of all, I've got to commend you on your work. I mean, that's wonderful that you were working in your home country to make an impact on those issues. And I think that's one of the most important things that we all can do, because like you had the knowledge of that country, you were there, you had an ability and an opportunity to make a difference. So a couple of things. I just want to clearly define the distinction between child porn versus the sex trafficking that we look at. So I definitely know quite a bit about child porn, but I definitely don't consider myself an expert, and especially not an expert on legalities in different countries. And the reason is that typically the perpetrators of sex trafficking and the perpetrators of child porn are usually different, very different profiles. So that to say that, with the sex traffickers that we see, it's often money and power motivated. They want to make a lot of money. They want to, maximize their status and things like that. Versus child porn creators or sellers tend to be a lot more tech savvy. So they know how to use like VPNs or special networks, and the investigators too. When you look at like sex trafficking versus child porn, the investigators are a lot more tech savvy when it comes to child porn, because there's a lot more of that technical side that they have to know. The CP, as we call child porn, the CP perpetrators typically know how to evade a lot of that. And so, and on top of that, to my understanding, it's not usually so much money motivated. It's more power and status within the community. So a lot of those groups, and I know there was a big one in Australia that was taken down successfully by Australian law enforcement, because they actually had to infiltrate the social network of that organization and basically get to the top and then shut it down. So just very different crimes, and usually very different perpetrators. Sometimes there's overlap, but I wouldn't say that's super frequent from what we see. But as far as legality in different countries, one thing I would say about that, because with us in our situation, sex work obviously has varying levels of legality in other countries. In the UK, it's legal. In the US, in most places, it's not legal. And so what we've taken away from that, because with the recent, protests around law enforcement, with recent concerns about, policing and all of these different things, a lot of companies are out there making statements, which I get. I mean, that's important. Raising your voice is important. But we felt like, what in our sphere of influence can we do to influence our users in, victim-centered policing and taking a better approach towards victims than sometimes is taken. And so something that we found really cool is that from our UK users, because sex work is legal in the UK, they have a kind of a different perspective towards sex trafficking, where they're really focused on what they call safeguarding. And that's basically putting the needs of the victim above anything else, providing services. And it's kind of a lot more of a hybrid model. And I think they have, in general, a better collaboration with like mental health experts and social workers and victim services organizations than we do in the US. So we've tried to learn from those users and then bring those best practices to like US law enforcement. And this is happening in a little bit in the US as well, but this is something that we're trying to spread. We are starting like an internal law enforcement podcast where we interview these people who are doing really good work, and they have the best practices, and then passing that on to the rest of the users. And one last example I'll give, and then we can go on to the next question, is Denver PD did this really, I live in Colorado, Denver PD did this really well. If you Google it, I'm sure you guys could find it, but they basically set up a like a mental health line that had, I think they started with like 2 mental health, social worker type experts, people who are well-versed in mental health issues. And basically the situation was, they said, okay, whenever there's a mental health situation, if someone's having a mental breakdown, someone needs services or needs assistance, just call this number and these 2 experts in a van will come and offer social services or help that person with whatever they're going through. And they found out that a huge percentage of the calls to that line actually came from law enforcement, because there were times when, and we probably all heard these stories, when a detective gets on a scene and someone's having a mental breakdown, there's no violence or anything for law enforcement to really respond to, but they don't know what to do because they may not be trained in that area. And so they set up this call line and these 2 people in a van that were able to come and actually provide meaningful services at that point of crisis. And so, yeah, we just want to do what we can do with our user community to say, these are the best practices, bring in the other experts when you need help. And I think a lot of that has been influenced by the fact that, there's different levels of legality in different countries that we work with. And that's allowed us to learn a lot from these different ways that people do it.
And I'm also just going to drop a link in the chat to another podcast called Hunting Warhead. This is a super heavy podcast, so this is not a casual peruse through when you're doing other things, but it very much goes into a lot of depth and speaks to some of the investigators from Australia who were in charge of and working on taking down that big child pornography ring. And it's just a very deep insight into how that ecosystem works globally and is appropriately disturbing. So again, it's not an easy one to get through, but I thought it was very well done given the intensity of the topic. But we're very short on time, so I want to touch on this one question because I think it's also an important one. Paula, who's from Colombia and has been studying a couple of papers that you've done with Professor Dabrowski and another group at USC looking in the same space about pretty much, from my understanding, doing this kind of work and scraping the ads, but in Spanish. So are you currently working in any languages besides English? Are there any plans to add new languages?
Yeah, great question. So the majority is in English so far. And a lot of that in some countries that we've seen is because like if you're talking about India, for example, a lot of the buyers of sex are Westerners. And so they're incentivized to make the ads in English, or at least partially in English. But we have done some research and testing with, I know, translating Chinese specifically, and then I believe Spanish as well, because we have done some testing in Mexico. So it's definitely possible. And actually, there's a lot of language translation tools that are available through like organizations like Amazon Web Services that you can apply to your like project or whatever it is. So, and we found those to work pretty well. Honestly, I would say the main challenge with working in new countries and deploying to new countries is usually the problem is not on the data side, getting the data side or translating the data. The challenge is more about the on the ground deployment. How do you find the people who would actually use the tool? How do you work with the local agencies and train them? How do you understand, even a huge part of it is understanding the situation locally, which is kind of impossible for like me as one person to do, for instance. Like I can't be on the ground in 5 countries at the same time. So the way that we've worked to remedy that so far is to partner with local nonprofits who are supporting law enforcement. They typically will have either someone on the ground, someone from that area, or someone who is dedicated to like one location. to study and understand the situation in that location, so that we're not going in and trying to provide a solution that's not, relevant to a specific, it can't necessarily translate perfectly from like one country to the next. So we found that collaboration to be really helpful, because there's a lot of great organizations who are working on the ground, who have that expertise in those local connections. And that, beyond the tech, that is really, really, really what's crucial to making sure that we actually make an impact on the ground.
Awesome. Well, Emily, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, both about your career and about the product and the impact that you're looking to have with what you're currently doing and beyond. So yeah, just thank you so much for taking that time, and I hope everyone appreciated the conversation as much as I did.
Yeah, thank you both for inviting me, and thanks everyone for the questions. It was great to chat with you guys this morning, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
And I dropped a link to Emily's website in case she has all her social, all her work gets linked there. So if you want to keep track of anything she's working on, go ahead and check out her website.
And one more thing, actually, I just thought of, I should have said this earlier. We're currently hiring. So if you go to marinusanalytics.com, MARINUS, and then to the top, careers, I think it's under contact and then careers, you can see what job descriptions we're currently hiring for, if that's something you're interested in.
Awesome. And I will drop that in the chat in about 5 seconds as well, in case anyone's interested for that too. But yeah, thank you so much for joining. And yeah, have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.